My name is Jessica Pishko. I am a journalist and a lawyer. I currently live in Asheville, North Carolina, but I spent most of my life in Texas. I am the author of the book, The Highest Law in the Land: How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Prior to working on this book, I had done journalism. I've been published in places like recently The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Nation, and Rolling Stone. And I've gotten a few journalism awards for my work. And I was a 2022 New America Fellow.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I'd love for you to begin by kind of giving us an overview of what a sheriff is, where the position came from, and how they differ from what we consider to be law enforcement or police as a whole, or how they fit in there too.
Well, absolutely. And I think it's always important to set this up front, not because I think people may not know, but also they may not have needed to know. So in essence, a sheriff is the elected law enforcement officer for the county, which means that they are not primarily responsible for city policing or municipal policing, but are really elected by the people of the county. And as a result, what they do is a little bit different from a police chief. Now, it can get very confusing because the United States has, I think, somewhere around 18,000 different policing agencies, right, from federal, state, and local levels. Now, a police chief is usually appointed by a mayor or city council, and they are then in charge of some sort of police force that primarily does urban policing. And to be fair, some police can be very small, right? You can have like a 2 or 3 person policing agency for a small town. And sheriffs, by contrast, are primarily tied to the land of the county, which means that their policing is bounded by where the county begins and ends. Now, some police do more or less policing within towns, sometimes smaller towns who might not want to or can't afford to build up their own police agencies will pay the sheriff to do some policing. But also, sheriffs are primarily responsible for most rural policing. So if you live outside of the town, in the county, or a lot of suburban policing. And as a result, like what they do, it can look a little bit different from place to place. The other thing sheriffs do is that they are primarily responsible for county jails. So about 85% of county jails are run by sheriffs. And again, they're elected law enforcement officials that run for office usually every 4 years.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a good overview of what they do. How did they develop in the United States? And then we'll kind of get into where it's developed since the 60s, I suppose.
Yeah. So, a lot of things in policing have changed since the 60s. So it's a good marker. And I think that sheriffs have changed as well. So according to sheriffs, they pride themselves on being the oldest form of law enforcement. And the reason they say that is because the office itself derives from an Anglo-Saxon style office that was called the shire reeve, right? So that became the word sheriff. And a shire reeve, like the sheriff of Nottingham, so people think of, right, the job of the shire reeve was primarily to collect taxes and impose the king's will in the counties or shires in sort of Anglo-Saxon England. Now, the job got imported to the colonies, and from what I can tell, it's not very well documented, but the use of sheriffs in kind of colonial America is pretty spotty. Virginia had some, but it really depended on what corporations were dominant in the colonies. And this is largely because the colonies themselves were sort of like corporate towns for a while. What we do know is that sheriffs as elected officials really started to take off when Andrew Jackson became president. This was a time called so some people frame it as Jacksonian democracy. And what Andrew Jackson wanted was to make more local offices elected. And the idea was that this would empower sort of the common man, or some people might call it like the yeoman farmer that Thomas Jefferson used to write about, right? And these were, of course, all white men. So Anglo-Saxon men, many of them were small farmers or merchants, and at this time as well, when Andrew Jackson was president, there were a lot of wars being fought. So primarily wars against Native Americans. So this was also when people living in the United States were removing land, right? So they're taking land from Native Americans and trying to shift some of those tribes to the West. At the same time, we started to engage in this period of westward expansion, right? So the Louisiana Purchase, as well as the Spanish-American War. So the United States was gaining territory to the West, was taking land from Native Americans, and Anglo settlers were starting to move west in this sort of quest to like get land and dominate land. And so this really was when the sheriff became the elected official that we think of today. So as states formed, the sheriff became elected. And to put it in context, a lot of local officials became elected, right? This is when we got things like elected county judges, elected county boards, so they were electing all sorts of officials, and the sheriff was among them. And the sheriff then became more important as well because as Anglo settlers moved west, there was not really standardized law enforcement, right? So law enforcement in this time was largely patchwork, right? There were what people refer to as slave catchers, right? So there were groups of people who would primarily police Black Americans who may or may not have been enslaved. There were, in the East, there were a lot of night watchman style or constable style policing. So this sort of small town policing that also was inherited from England. And sheriffs really became important in the West. And a lot of this is because one, there were, as a result of these wars, there were a lot of decommissioned military officers. What seemed to have happened is that a lot of these decommissioned officers went west, and a lot of them also became sheriffs or became kind of sheriff-style vigilantes, which in a lot of Western states, they sort of became something similar. In California, they called them vigilance committees, right? And this was like a local style law enforcement where they would meet up and decide, let's say there was a problematic like cattle thief, right? So people would meet in the saloon and come up with a plan, and then they would implement that plan. So sheriffs sort of spread westward that way. And this is when I think we got the idea of like the John Wayne horse and hat. And right, even though a lot of those, to be fair, a lot of that ideas of the cowboy ideas were adopted from like Mexican cowboys who had this apparel first. So just to be fair, this was sort of styling that got borrowed. It also kind of helps explain why like sheriffs tended to have a more kind of militia style of policing as compared to some Eastern police, right? So like their uniforms often looked more militia style. The style of their policing involved more horseback, like sort of running across wide distances on horseback, and it had a kind of more militia style. And some people have probably heard the word posse. So the posse power was basically how sheriffs got their deputies. So the idea was that every kind of adult male, between like 16 and 45 or 50 would have their gun. And if the sheriff needed people, they would do what they called the hue and cry, and the posse would come and assemble and then, go out and do whatever kind of law enforcement activity they felt like needed to be done.
Right. And I think that you unpacked some of these early threads, very nicely in the book. And we'll get to the posse comitatus movement in a little bit. But I think a logical next point would be, you've kind of covered how law enforcement looked like. What was imprisonment and jail like, and how did that develop under the sheriff?
So the other thing sheriffs started to do pretty quickly was run county jails. And what's important to know about county jails, and actually most of the work of the sheriff and most work of policing, was that it was a fee-for-service system. So in essence, the sheriff would get an individual that they needed to hold. So sometimes it would be Black Americans who, let's say someone had tried to escape enslavement. They might get handed over to the sheriff, who would hold them in the jail for a certain period of time. The enslaver might come and then pay a fee and take that person with them. Or in some places, let's say the enslaver didn't come, the sheriff was entitled to sell that individual and keep the profits. So that was one way that sheriffs made their fees. They also tended to hold kind of a variety of people. Now, to bear in mind, most of these early jails held only men. Women were not commonly in jail for kind of a variety of reasons that women did not really start getting policed and in jail until kind of urbanization time. And this is mostly for sexism reasons. Every once in a while, sheriffs would take care of children and women. So usually the jail is attached to the house. So like a typical Midwestern jail would be attached to the house, might be an attic or a basement. And the sheriff and his wife would basically be in charge of the whole thing. So there's a lot of stories of like the wife would cook the meals, serve the meals to the people who were being held in the jail. If there were children or women, usually it was the wife's job to take care of them. So they would not usually stay in the jail area, but they might be like in a guest room or something like that. And they would be held that way until the sheriff could collect his fee. So the incentive to keep the people in your jail alive and healthy was to collect the fee, right? Because if the individual escaped or died, you would not collect your fee. The biggest problem at that time, honestly, was escape, as you can imagine, because these jails were not very secure. They were, of course, building materials were like wood and straw, so things caught fire, people could dig through wood and straw. So this was like a big concern of early sheriffs, was people escaping from jail. And some places started to build bigger jails. Los Angeles is an example of a place that started building bigger jails, but they were not really that large until we got to like post-World War II. The other thing sheriffs started to do, especially after the Civil War, after Reconstruction period, was they engaged in a practice called convict leasing. So what sheriffs would do is arrest people for violating a wide number of laws, often called black codes. And these were very strict laws, only applied to Black Americans, that were basically forbid people from traveling or for not working. These are a lot of laws that today we might call like loitering laws, or there were laws like you couldn't be out after curfew. If you didn't have a letter from your employer, you might get arrested. So, and maybe sometimes like if you stole something, this would happen sometimes, like someone might steal a pig, let's say, because they needed something to eat, or et cetera. So there was a wide variety of crimes for which sheriffs could arrest Black Americans and then basically rent their labor to private industries, right? And it was both farming, agriculture, but there was also a lot of other industries. There was mining. In Florida, they would be sent to the Everglades to get sap from trees, tar to produce like tar and rubber in factories. And these jobs were, I mean, first of all, really, really awful. The conditions were terrible, just appalling, really appalling conditions of people living in, I mean, no shoes, no clothes, just, bare bones kind of stuff. And the other issue was generally that people were not, they were not really told. It wasn't like they were giving a set sentence. Their sentences sometimes they would get time added on. They would say, oh, you owe fees. So people would also just be incarcerated to be told they would have to work off fees. There were also a lot of children, like particularly young Black boys. So sometimes boys as young as like 8 or 10. We're also sent to labor. So it was a really, really terrible system. A large percent died. A large percent tried to run away, and a large percent died. And, this was a practice that went on for a pretty long time, and sheriffs greatly profited from it. It really only started to end kind of towards the 20s and 30s. And honestly, the end of convict leasing mostly came because workers, kind of public officials, white public officials, workers in industry thought that it became concerned about the impact on business. And so the practice kind of started to fade out. Now, of course, we have remnants of that, right? Like if you go to Angola, the big prison in Louisiana, people still work in the fields. It's common in almost every jail. Most people still have to work in jail. So they might work in the kitchen. they might sweep, they might, sometimes there's people who assist with like paperwork, right? Sometimes people incarcerated jails do that work too. So like the concept of having people who are incarcerated and then still being forced to work, usually for pretty low wages or no wages, is something that's still really, I think, pretty common almost everywhere today. In some places, sheriffs have even more leeway. So, because sheriffs are independently elected, and we'll talk more about this, that they lack a lot of oversight, sheriffs have also habitually used people in their jails to do things like campaign. So sometimes they use them to pass out campaign flyers. A few sheriffs have been known to like use people to do things like set up barbecues. So let's say they were having like a big party. They would bring people to assist with the party, wash cars, mow lawns, fix. Another big one was having them fix church roofs. Let's say there needed to be like jobs to be done. So this it still is really common, and this kind of personal use of people incarcerated. I think the reason why we still have that, sheriffs have that sense that they're entitled to it, is because that was what the job was, right? The people held in the jail were sort of considered like the sheriff's people, not, was it under the idea that it was the state, but rather like the sheriff's people.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because it seems to me that the argument you're making is that the sheriff was very much a part and parcel of maintaining a strict racialized set of societal rules once slavery ended. They kind of continued those black codes, which were reinstalling slavery after the Civil War. And then once we get to the civil rights movement, kind of post-World War II and that prosperity era, we now have civil rights movement, and again, sheriffs become associated with maintaining racial boundaries and enforcing codes of, differentiation and things like that, especially in the South. As I think that when we think of the opposing forces of freedom marchers, they're usually sheriffs, correct?
That's right. So, I mean, one of the things about sheriffs is that because they were sort of considered really powerful local officials, that they were frequent opponents of, Black people who were trying to get better police. I mean, honestly, better policing and better government. And I think that what you're saying also links to this long-standing desire of Black voters to try to elect sheriffs that better match their values, right? So during the civil rights era, for example, there were large attempts to either elect Black sheriffs or at least sheriffs who were like kind of anti-segregationist. I mean, sometimes it was just someone who might promise not to be, to not promise to try to prevent lynchings, right? And the idea, which made sense at the time, was Black Americans said to their, the voters said, oh, well, if we elect our own sheriff, they'll protect us from the Klan. They'll protect us from Klan violence. They'll protect us from lynchings, right? They saw the opportunity to elect a sheriff as something that might be transform policing to be in their favor, because especially in the South, the sheriff was both, this sort of gets to like the sheriff as sort of a police, but also something like someone people looked up to, someone with a lot of local authority, right? Like everybody knew the sheriff, and when he goes to the grocery store or, church, like everybody would know who the sheriff was. And so, people saw that and recognized it. Now, the problem was that because of white supremacy, because of, kind of a deep system of racial hierarchy, right? Sheriffs used both what you might call tricks, like basically election fraud. So either not letting people vote, destroying votes, moving voting places around, or they used outright violence, right? So there are also horrible stories of just outright violence against particularly Black Americans who were voting. And I think that is something that is, it's like kind of a signifier of the civil rights movement. And as you say, it is also something that like this is a legacy in the South. There's a sort of quote where white local officials said, kind of whatever hoity-toity the white people of the South would say, like, well, I would rather have a Black man be a senator or a legislator and not a sheriff, because the sheriff is the person who deals with everything day to day. And I don't want, right? The idea was that the white business elites did not want someone Black telling them what to do day to day. It was also a big fear of allowing Black Americans to own firearms. So this was also another reason why, right, the office was really determined to keep itself really white, really male. And that persists to this day, right? About 90% of sheriffs are white men, 3% are women. So, right, it remains today like a very white male office. Whereas I think if you look at police chiefs, I don't want to argue they're like the diversity matches like the population, but they are slightly more diverse than sheriffs are.
Well, and through this progression that you've just kind of mapped out for us, there emerges some very strange theories about just how much power the sheriff has, where this power originates, and how autonomous they are. And I think part of it comes from this justification of being elected, but then some of it comes from like the Christian identity movement and some of like remnants of the Klan, pulling out of the posse idea. So I'd love for you to tie those together for us.
Yeah. So one of the arguments I make in the book specifically is that this early history of the sheriff made it already prone to sort of radicalization by what we might call like far right extremist forces. So, right, because sheriffs were already seen as kind of independent elected police figures who could enforce racial hierarchies. What did happen, and this happened kind of throughout the sort of era, like post Brown v. Board of Education era, right? There's a sort of series of individuals associated with the far right. One of the people I talk about in my book is a man named William Potter Gale, who is from Southern California. He, really rose to prominence in this era of desegregation. And his idea was that, which was a very popular idea at the time, was that local counties could resist desegregation. And I think you have to put this in the context of this, what some people call the Southern strategy, right? That the idea that states did not have to desegregate their schools, according to Brown v. Board of Education, was an intensely popular idea in the South, right? It was like the motivating political philosophy for a lot of white people. So this was like what, right, this was what entire political systems were being built on. Now, William Potter Gale sort of took this idea and merged it with like a form of Christianity that he called Christian identity. And what Christian identity really is just, it's basically kind of neo-Nazi. The ideology is neo-Nazi. It's just white supremacy, anti-Semitism. It has this idea that like the Anglo-Saxons are the real Israelites of the Bible, and there's a sort of complicated theology behind it, but the root of it is just justifying white supremacy via religion. And this became the basis of, right, what later became known as like the Aryan Brotherhood, all sorts of neo-Nazi movements. But what they all had in common was that they thought that the sheriff was the only legitimate law enforcement officer. And so from that, there was a movement that William Potter Gale kind of created, but it spread pretty quickly to the West and Midwest, called Posse Comitatus. Posse Comitatus essentially recruited groups of mostly white men into small posses. They wore little stars, little gold stars, and they considered themselves kind of like quasi-vigilante law enforcement. And their ideology was that the sheriff was the only legitimate law enforcement. Now, to be fair, at the time, sheriffs were not that into this, right? Like most of the time, they saw Posse Comitatus members, and they really kind of started to become steadily more violent throughout the 70s and 80s. They saw them as like a criminal organization. They were very violent. They engaged in a lot of shootouts with police. They were very anti-police. They also recruited a large number of people in the Midwest, particularly people whose farms had been foreclosed on. So there was a sort of what people call the farm crisis in the 80s. A lot of people did lose their farms, but this was a real thing that happened. They were in genuine distress. And Posse Comitatus sort of gave them an explanation, which is like they blamed Jewish bankers, they blamed immigrants, right? So they blamed kind of outsiders for this like loss of American identity. And the Posse kind of instilled in people this idea of like self-governance. They also were the root of what some people call sovereign citizen ideology, which is kind of like fake law. So they would teach people how to like file fake liens or oppose their foreclosure. So this was a whole like kind of like an alternate law enforcement legal system that was mostly popular in rural areas. So it was, you know, to be fair, it was pretty small. It was not like a big movement, but it got a lot of attention in the 80s because it was really violent. And some of the major players engaged in shootouts. And what sort of happened was, honestly, a lot of them died and went to prison. Sort of faded out, but the remnants became what we might call the militia or patriot movement in the 90s. And I was not sure if you wanted me to go on or pause.
I think that it goes into my next question. Yeah.
Yeah. So what became the sort of patriot movement or militia movement of the 90s was basically the remnants of Posse Comitatus. And so some people might remember Ruby Ridge. So there's a few major incidents that sort of created this rise of the far right in the 90s. So there was Ruby Ridge in 1992, and this was an incident involving a man who was, I think he was part of the Aryan Nation, but also kind of a survivalist. He lived on this mountain in Idaho with his family. And he was a Christian identitarian for sure. He was like certainly opposed to, certainly wanted to only be with white people. And this was also the time when Idaho was kind of becoming like the homeland for the Aryan Nation. So there was a lot of people at Idaho who thought this. And the FBI and US Marshals engaged in a shootout where they killed his wife and baby, and another individual who was staying with them. And this created like a huge panic among far right militia types, right? Because it felt like the federal government had attacked them. And they screwed up, right? This was a terrible, it was a terrible violent thing. And then shortly, just a year after that, we had Waco, which having grown up in Texas, I remember Waco, another kind of botched FBI raid. You know, the Branch Davidians were not necessarily Christian identitarians. They were sort of had, I think, a different belief system. But what happened was when the FBI, engaged in this very long standoff, ultimately killing children, right? A large number of people were killed. It really inspired people who were upset about Ruby Ridge already, right? So they came, so every time, so when Waco happened, all these people would come and hang out, right, to sort of protest the FBI. Like it became and one of those people who was at Waco is Timothy McVeigh, who most people would know because in 1995, he was responsible for bombing the federal building in Oklahoma City, right? And he was probably not technically part of a militia. He was inspired by this whole like circle of militia members, gun shows. It was kind of just a circuit of like what we would call like far right activity. A lot of pamphlets and radio shows and material produced. And so this was just a time when these materials were kind of being produced, and there was this movement. After 1995 and the Oklahoma City bombing, the federal government became very interested in cracking down on this far right militia movement. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and really both the federal government and all of law enforcement sort of transformed their attention to threats from abroad. So then we got more concerns about like external terrorism, right? And the eye sort of shifted away from like what we might call like domestic terrorism to threats from abroad. But I think in talking about that history, you can totally see how this came back, right? Because it sounds an awful lot like things that we see today and a lot of the similar attitudes, anti-federal attitudes that we see today.
Well, let's talk about that anti-federalism, because in the book, you make very clear that sheriffs, or at least a small segment of them, and maybe growing, you would have better idea of the numbers to date, but there's this idea that the sheriff is, as you said before, the only real authority and somehow the only protector of the Constitution, and is the only one imbued with some sort of law enforcement, and the federal government is not, and other municipal, are not holding up the Constitution in its originalist, kind of way. So can you talk about how that idea developed and what we're seeing today with that?
So a lot of these sheriffs, so today we call this movement mostly the quote unquote constitutional sheriff movement. And by that, they mean the sheriff is responsible only for upholding the Constitution. And to be clear, when they say Constitution, they mean the first 10 amendments. So they mean, like, I just want to be clear, like they're talking about, so it's very states' rights focused, as you said, very Second Amendment focused, very focused on private property, right? So the idea that like you could keep people off your private property, that you don't have to like let the government onto your property. And also the idea of like religion, this idea of sort of like the importance of religious speech, which is something else we see like really coming up. It doesn't include like the post-Reconstruction amendments. It doesn't include like the 19th Amendment, especially doesn't include the amendment that created like federal income federal taxes are like hugely disliked by constitutional sheriffs in the far right. So this idea that like the sheriff was the person that would protect the people in the county from what they call the overreaching federal government, which is a bit like, if you say it's overreaching, it's already bad, right? So they'll say federal overreach, right? This idea that the federal government was telling people what to do. Now that idea, again, is very old and comes directly from segregationists, right? That was what they called overreaching government, was the government telling them you have to desegregate. I mean, and ultimately the federal government did have to send National Guard in to force people to desegregate. So sometimes I remind people, right, like the Civil War did happen, like it was a war to end slavery, and desegregation did not happen without some amount of force, right? So this is like this is pushing towards the federal government, kind of almost pushing towards the edge of asking the federal government to respond with force, right? Because we have seen this happen before. Now, the constitutional sheriff movement, I think they would say that they're not interested in violence or force, that they see themselves as keeping the peace, right? That they will keep it peaceful because they will stand between, they use the word interpose, they will interpose themselves between the federal government and the people of their county. But I think when you hear that, it's like to remember that those are words and ideas that came from segregationists, even though the leaders of the constitutional sheriff movement, we could talk a little bit about, would say that they are not racist, right? I want to be clear that they say that they would apply it in what we would call like a race neutral manner. But it is undoubtedly true that the only other people who use that framing and language were people associated with segregationists. So I think that sort of just to belie the fact that they're not saying that. And a lot of them talk about like civil rights icons as heroes, but to remember that that's language and ideas that come from that movement. And also they're not like valid law. I mean, I actually was a bit confused, it's spoken about so much that I think it could feel almost confusing. Like, is it law? Like, it's not law. Like, that's not how it works. We do have, of course, a federalist system in which states have some power and the federal government has some power. We do see today that there are states attempting to do something like states' rights. Texas is an example, right? Texas is basically pushing to the brink, I would say, pushing to the brink of like, what is states' rights? So we see that kind of boundary being pushed, but it doesn't mean that that's like, because we see this boundary being pushed, I would say this is like an old trend that we have seen over and over. And two, it doesn't really make it like a valid legal argument.
Well, and I think, especially in the 90s, there's a lot of this talk, as you illustrated. But I think in the 2000s with the internet, it kind of went under the surface a little bit. And then since COVID, we've had
Mhm.
a real uh, convergence of what would be like far right conspiracy theories with this nonsense law, like what you're talking about with the constitutional sheriffs, and they converge. And maybe you want to talk about some of the people who have emerged from this movement and how they've opposed, how they used COVID and the mask mandates and the shutdown as a launching pad for some of their more, whether or not they're legitimate or not, but some of their more long-standing grievances like gun rights and immigration and election protection and all this kind of stuff, which again, as you said, comes right out of the segregationist, white power movement of those post-Civil War.
Yes, I mean, like I said, because I think that sheriffs will say it's not true, but like it's important to always keep in mind that that's really like what they're saying. It's the same tactics. So, one of the main leaders of the constitutional sheriff movement was an ex sheriff named Richard Mack. He was a sheriff in rural Arizona for 2 terms. And he became famous in the 90s because he joined a few other sheriffs with the NRA to sue over the Brady handgun bill. Now, the Brady handgun bill was a big deal. One, because it was sort of the first major federal legislation over handguns that in a very long time, like since the 60s. So it was a really big deal. And two, it came after a lot of series of concerns of guns, right? There was an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. And so everyone was like very concerned about political violence and guns in general. Even the political support for the Brady bill was so great, right? Republicans supported it, law enforcement supported it, and the NRA realized that they were going to lose in the politics world, so they decided to sue. And their theory was that, well, the Brady bill required county sheriffs to conduct background checks, and that is not allowed under states' rights, right? So they made sort of a 10th Amendment rule kind of argument that said you can't compel local law enforcement to do background checks, and they won, right? In an opinion written by Justice Antonin Scalia with a concurrence by Clarence Thomas asserting the what became the Bruin case and the Second Amendment law we have today. They said no, the federal government cannot compel county sheriffs to do background checks. Now, to be clear, the ruling doesn't have a lot of practical applicability because background checks are automatic now on computers at point of sale, so you don't need the county sheriff to do it. This was sort of before we had computerized. Now, I will to also say in most states and many counties where we still have handgun licensing, it is the sheriff who does it, right? It is sheriffs who issue concealed carry permits and of course collect the fees. And it is sheriffs who are generally in charge of like gun licensing. So this is like a long-standing thing that sheriffs did and have done for a long time. Now, after winning this lawsuit, the lawsuit is called Prince v. United States. Richard Mack reprinted it and put his name on it. So he calls it Mack v. United States. And then, of course, also involves like his favorite, like the far right's favorite villain, the Clintons. So like the Clintons have always been kind of a villain to the right. And so he used that, right? It involved all the classic characters. So he used that to kind of go on the road. And so he would appear with many militia groups in the 90s. He was at Waco. He says he talked to Timothy McVeigh, although I can't confirm that it's true. He generally kind of started to like pop up everywhere there was militia activity, but he didn't really take off until Stuart Rhodes formed what the Oath Keepers, right? And this was kind of around 2010, 2011. And of course, Barack Obama was president, and the first Black president kind of re-inspired all these far-right forces. There were a lot of concerns about handgun regulation, and people may remember the shooting massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, right? And there were many lawmakers who wanted to pass laws. Barack Obama made a statement wanting to pass more firearm restrictions. And at that time, that's when Richard Mack really started to get popularity among sheriffs. So he got a couple of hundred sheriffs to sign a letter opposing any gun regulation. In light of such a tragedy, right? It still became sort of political capital. Now, So with all that background, right, and kind of setting all that up, Mac had already formed his organization. He called the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. He was already in league with Oath Keepers and Three Percenters, so he was sort of in that movement. When COVID hit, what seems to have happened was, one, there was a huge kind of rise in militia activity. And I remember, and other people may remember, right, there were a lot of protests, a lot of armed protests, particularly in suburban and rural areas across the country, opposing mask mandates and business closures, a lot in the Midwest in particular, right? And so as this kind of proto-militia activity rose, people like Richard Mack decided that this was an opportunity to exploit. He started to have these calls and meetings with sheriffs across the country. And, to kind of put a little like fairness on it, in many cases, sheriffs were not sure what to do. So COVID came, and I think everyone can understand, like, many people were confused what to do, and sheriffs were among them. And then these sheriffs started to see like an immense backlash to all business closures and masking restrictions, right, among their constituents. Sheriffs are, of course, elected locally. So they thought, well, this is not good. I can't, and they're sort of a libertarian stripe, both sheriffs anyway. So they were like, I don't like this. This feels like too much government regulation. I don't want to tell people to put their mask on it, this sort of thing. And so they started to reconvene around, with Richard Mack kind of guiding them. And Richard Mack said, hey, well, I already said the sheriff can not follow laws if he doesn't want to. And so guess what? You don't have to follow federal mandates if you don't want to. And so this kind of lets you off the hook. Right? So we had all these meetings and trainings throughout 2020 and 2021. It was really popular in Texas. So we had a lot of meetings. Like, he had to have them in churches. He had one at a Christian college in Lynchburg, Virginia, because they were all unmasked. So there was this like sort of limit on where he could have unmasked gatherings. And as everyone knows, right, it became like an immense political partisan issue. And sheriffs kind of joined into that, arguing that this was like a grave example of government overreach. And people responded, right? Like, this is when I started to see all sorts of groups of people, including there were groups of moms with children who didn't like masks for children. They all kind of ran to constitutional sheriffs. So all these groups kind of flocked to the idea, again, that the sheriff was the law enforcement official best suited for this moment. And I think that really started, one, it became really popular and started to take off. Two, it coincided with kind of an immense shift to the right of the GOP under Trump, right? Trump had already shifted the GOP to the right. People were feeling very anti-government. Then, of course, we had, January 6th, which was more, right? It says like a general increase in this like anti-government activity, very much spurred by both COVID, but also the Black Lives Matters protests in the summer of 2020, also invigorated the right. And is another huge like gathering point for sheriffs and constitutional sheriffs also, who felt like these protests were immensely dangerous. You, again, can see sort of flashbacks to the 60s and the civil rights movement, right? There was this like desire to not have these protests that were framed both as kind of anti-police violence, but also like it was called Black Lives Matter, right? It was a civil rights movement in that tradition.
Yeah, and to the degree that this has continued through the Biden administration, we've seen some of it play out in election denialism and the immigration discussions we've had. So if you could we'll wrap up on these two last points where, obviously the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes got one of the longest sentences for January 6th. So where do these sheriffs fit into the immigration debate, and how did they end up? I think we know, you've given us a great roadmap, how they ended up at January 6th with all the other law enforcement that was there.
So one of the interesting things is that, yes, the Oath Keepers and a lot of militias did kind of disintegrate because of the prosecutions and because Stuart Rhodes was put in prison. People people didn't want to be associated with someone who went to prison. What we do see now is kind of a splintering of these groups. Like, they've sort of reformatted in kind of the local level. But it's interesting because the constitutional sheriff one has felt like a constant thread, right? That it, and to be honest, like these talking points they have are kind of the talking points of like of Donald Trump as as running for president, right? He opposes the federal, he says he doesn't like the federal government. He says, and he is particularly fond of sheriffs, which is something I point out in the book, right? He's sort of very fond of this like idea of how sheriffs police, I think, which is sort of goes back to this like militia oriented and military oriented policing that can feel, sometimes the idea is that city police or the FBI or the ATF are very concerned with rules and regulations. And the idea of sheriffs is sort of like, and I think we have this idea, whether positive or negative, right? They get justice at the end of the day, even if their methods are not like on paper, right? Like the idea that like I'm doing the right thing, even if my paperwork is not like exactly how the paperwork is supposed to look. And we have like positive examples too, right? Of like sheriffs who are like, oh, but I did the right thing. You just didn't do the right papers or whatever, codes or something like that. So this idea of like that we need to be away from administrative work. And this goes to the election and immigration too, right? Constitutional sheriffs and MAC have always been opposed to immigration, and you can sort of see that as a through line of white supremacy, right? That most of the immigrants that they, of course, oppose are Black and brown. And the idea that sheriffs could get involved in elections is honestly something that I think sheriffs, Richard Mack and other constitutional sheriffs jumped on as an opportunity to reassert their power, right? So there were deep concerns about voting and voting fraud. Voting is, of course, is conducted on the local level. Like we do have this disaggregated voting system. People do vote by county. And so they thought, oh, well, hey, I'm a county official and I'm elected. So like I can obviously get involved in voting conspiracies, watching ballot boxes, kind of agitating about the politics of it. I think it's important to remember that because sheriffs run for office, they can say a lot more than other officials. So, to put it frankly, the like beat cop or even a police chief or an FBI agent can't make political statements. They have to, right? Whatever their political ideology, the idea is that they're neutral administrators. They can't make a political statement. They can't endorse a presidential candidate, but sheriffs can because they are elected, because they are politicians. They can make political statements. So they can say something like, "Oh, I don't like Joe Biden's immigration policy," right? Which is not something even Border Patrol can say. Border Patrol can't say they don't like it. They have to do. Joe Biden is their boss. They have to do what Joe Biden says they have to do. But sheriffs would say, well, he's not my boss and I can say I don't like it, right? So I think that also is like they've tapped into this ability to agitate. And this is again, while they might say they're apolitical, like it's very clear that they're agitating right for MAGA. Like it's not it's not sort of a neutral, not neutral. It's like for example, they oppose abortion rights. Important to keep in mind, oppose like the rights of LGBTQ Americans, things like gay marriage. So all of these things are things that constitutional sheriffs agree with the sort of what I would call kind of the radicalized Republican Party on.
So you end the book with a pretty dire prescription as far as where you stand on the role of sheriffs and whether or not this position should continue to be part of our law enforcement landscape. So would you walk us through your thinking on that?
So as I worked on this book and in general, one of the things I began to think a lot about is what does the system of policing that we have mean, and how do we talk about policing, and how do we talk about incarceration? For a long time, I've always been interested in reducing incarceration and policing. And I think that as I worked on this book and as time went on, as we saw COVID, as we saw, 2020, and then the backlash to 2020, what I realized was that the system is kind of rigged such that when people demand or get change, the system sort of immediately absorbs that change and goes back to what it was, right? So we have more police shootings now than we did like before 2020. So that like these protests did not change. COVID did not really result in like a change in mass incarceration, despite the known dangers to people in incarcerated settings. And so what I honestly began to think was like a very serious thought about restructuring and changing policing is needed. Now, I will say that I am a person who generally thinks like there should be less police. There should be less police. There should be fewer jails. We should not have, we have too much. There's too much policing. And so to that end, sheriffs seem to me like a very disposable kind of policing, right? That they are, we see that they are the most conservative, the most prone to far right radicalization, and very, very political, right? It strikes me as very dangerous to have political figures who purport to police their communities. I talk about jails in the book, and one of the things about jails that people may know is that they're very dangerous and poorly regulated, and people die, and they're run by elected sheriffs. And so to have an elected sheriff who supports Donald Trump, who goes to the Claremont Institute to learn about the law, a highly politicized individual who is not looking out maybe for the best of their community, to have those people in charge of maybe the most vulnerable people strikes me as just as getting to the root, the heart of what is a lie, right? Because sheriffs will say, well, I represent the community because I'm elected. But if that's true, then they're not representing the people who most rely on them for help, right? The people who call the police, the people who are in jail, who are in mental health crisis. I was just thinking of this, the woman who was shot by a sheriff's deputy in Indiana, right? Like the people who are calling the sheriff, the people who call the police, the people who are in the custody of the sheriff, the very political sheriffs who are used jails often as kind of their own political workshop. But like those are not, they're not representing those people. And so how can they say that they're democratic, that they are for the people when they're really not, right? And if you look at what people want, like people do want gun control. I mean, these are also like the sheriffs make it look like what they do is democratic because there are a lot of sheriffs and a lot of them represent rather rural counties. So it's a bit like the Electoral College. So when 200 sheriffs say we oppose these firearm rules, or in Illinois, for example, 80 something sheriffs were like, we oppose all these firearm rules. It looks like a lot of people, but it's not. It's not even close to half of the people. Right? More than half of the people elected their Democrat governor and their legislature who wanted to impose firearm rules. So they sort of have this way of like making it look like this is more popular than it is. And that, I think, like I said, that on top of the fact that they really do have this job that they aren't doing very well, leads me to think that, right, it's a bad idea. It's not working out particularly well.